Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Joseph Ryder Anderson podcast. So, today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite decks, as well as a custom build of mine, which is the Gyutaro Demon Slayer Purple deck. So, this deck has a lot going for it, and I have tested the wazoo out of this deck. I've used it to win tournaments, I've used it for all kinds of shenanigans, and I can't wait to use it especially for the Demon Slayer Rare Battle format. I think this deck will be particularly strong in the Demon Slayer Rare Battle format. It just has everything you want from a top tier deck for the most part. I think the only area that it's lacking is it does lack a little bit of added removal that some other of the top tier decks have. But it's so fast and consistent, and also has one of the better draw engines in the game that more than make up for some of the shortcomings in the removal department. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking through every card in this deck, going over why it's included, what it does, how it works with the other cards in this deck to unlock a lot of powerful combos. And then we're also going to talk about some of the matchups you're going to face in the primarily in the store tournament format, just regular good old Union Arena format, as well as take a look at some of the rare battle matches that you can face. So going first, we're going to go with a very key card to this deck. Again, I have my deck laid out in front of me on the table as I'm talking about this. I was just running a test against Geass Purple, but if you obviously aren't going to have this in front of you, go to my website for the podcast episode. It's going to have this deck as an image file. Take a look at that. That's the best place. This deck, I've actually not written about this exact version yet. It's my most up-to-date version of the Gyutaro build. So you will want to go and look at that podcast episode link to get the full build if you want to build this yourself. Okay. So starting out, we have Gyutaro, zero cost Gyutaro. So this card, we run 4 copies of this card. Couple of things to take into consideration about this card. There are 0 triggers on this card. So this is a triggerless 0 cost, which is the only bummer about this card. Otherwise, it's a pretty solid card. It's got 2,000 BP, which may not sound like a lot, but if you promote him early to the front line, he can negate your opponent's attempts to poke at your life early on. So it's definitely a decent card. He's going to be your primary raid target for your bigger Gyutaro, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that bigger Gyutaro, your 4-cost raid Gyutaro, is actually this deck's strongest character. So he's a great card. Only downside is he doesn't have a trigger, but it's fine because in this deck build, you're only going to have 8 non-triggers, so that doesn't really matter. The last thing about this card, and don't overlook it, because I actually did lose a battle one time because I didn't use this, and that is the activate main. So you pay 1 AP to draw a card. So that's actually not that great. So you're not really going to want to do that a lot. You can already use your 1 AP to draw at the beginning of the turn. However, if you don't get what you need and you really just need one card, which I was in a situation where I really could have just drawn 1 extra card, and had I drawn that extra card, I would have won. Don't be like me in that scenario. Make sure you pay attention to use this effect if you really need it. Most of the time, you're not going to need it, but don't forget about it. Moving on to your other 0-cost characters, you have, I don't even know how to say this, but I think it's Warhabime. So don't get mad at me if I said that wrong, but this is basically Daki in her geisha form. So she's a 0-cost. This one does have the very handy get trigger, and she is treated as Daki. This is important because your Gyutaro effects will be a lot greater because of having Daki on field. So she's just a solid 0-cost. She's mostly here because she has the get trigger, but it doesn't hurt that she's Daki because she's going to unlock some of your effects that Gyutaro has. Lastly, we have Tionai. So Tionai is the last 0-cost character, and he really is solely here because he's got a draw card trigger. So we run 4 copies of him, 1500 BP, not a super strong card. He does have a decent effect where in this deck you would only really use this because this particular build is not running lower your heads or anything like that, or purge. This particular build, he might be helpful to use as a chump blocker to then promote someone else to your front line to then further defend your front line against attacks. Otherwise, he's really just here because he has a draw trigger. I very rarely use him defensively, although it is an option and it could potentially win you a game. So check him out. The way he works is when he's sidelined, you can basically promote a character from your front. Well, you can move either way. You can move a character from your energy line to your front line. From your front line to your energy line. Usually, you're going to want to use this to move a character from your energy line to your front line. You can also swap characters. You probably wouldn't want to do that unless if, I suppose, you've taken like a special off of life. There really isn't a lot of scenarios where you'd want to do that in this particular build. He's really handy in Muzan because you can use him to promote your Muzan. Maybe at the start of your turn you didn't have enough discard or cards in your sideline to promote Muzan. In this deck, obviously, we're not running Muzan. So again, that was a lot to talk about TNI. Basically, he's just here for the draw a card trigger. Moving on, so we've covered your 0-cost characters. Now let's talk about the next character who's very important and easy to overlook, but that's your 1-cost Daki character. So Daki has 2000 BP, which is decent for a 1-cost character, but really why she's here is twofold. Again, she doesn't have a trigger, so she's your only other card in this deck without a trigger. That brings you up to that magical 8 non-trigger cards in your deck, which is what you want. This Daki has a powerful when sidelined effect. So when she is sidelined, you can look at the top 6 cards for any Gyutaro card there and add it to your hand. That's pretty insane. So Gyutaro is the backbone of this deck. So having a card that lets you look 6 cards deep on the top of your deck for that Gyutaro is super helpful. That's why there are 4 of her in this deck. So she is a fantastic card to promote early. You really want her on your front line so you can use her to block. She's very effective being sidelined. So really look to promote her and use her as an early game rusher, really is what she's good for. And don't ignore that when sidelined effect. The only thing to keep in mind is that if you do add a Gyutaro from the top 6 cards of your deck using this ability, you will have to sideline a card from your hand. So that's not a huge deal. You draw a lot of cards with this deck, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So it's not a huge deal to have to add a card to your sideline from your hand, but just make sure you have enough cards in your hand to do it. If you see a Gyutaro and you don't want to discard a card from your hand for that Gyutaro, you don't need that Gyutaro, you don't have to do it. That's part of the rules. So you can look at the top 6. Even if there is a Gyutaro in there, you don't have to add it to your hand. So that's something to keep in mind. Most of the time you're going to want to, because Gyutaro is very effective in this deck, but you don't have to do it. I will also add that because we have Enmu, which we'll talk about in a bit, because we have Enmu, getting more cards in your sideline does not hurt you. It could help you boost up your Enmu and take some positive trades later down the road in combat. So let's move on to the next card. The next, for energy cost wise, is the 2-cost Enmu character. So this Enmu is actually deceptively strong. He has 2500 BP. He has the active trigger. One of the main reasons that he's in this deck is because he has the active trigger. That's insane for a 2-cost character. Super helpful. If you don't know what the active trigger is, it is a trigger that lets you restand a character who has been rested, or just a character that is rested. Switch them to active. So you may have already blocked with one of these characters. You can then re-switch them to active and block again. Plus they gain 3000 BP. So they're essentially blocking most threats, and perhaps all threats depending on what their base BP is. So that alone is enough to add this enemy to the deck, but there's more. So we do have a win played effect. So if you have had a card sideline this turn, you get to draw a card when you play Enmu. Now, in Muzan decks or decks that use the lower your heads and purge and maybe the 3-cost Muzan, that's an insane ability to be able to just draw a card, because you're sidelining characters all the time. It unlocks insane draw, and you can combo it with purge and all these things to just draw a ton of cards. In this deck, it's not as helpful. I'm going to be honest. You won't get it off all the time. There are a couple of circumstances where it is helpful, though. You do have your 4-cost Gyutaro, who, when you play him, sidelines a character with 3000 BP or less. You can use that when sidelining effect to then play Enmu, draw a card. You might have heard me slap that card down because I have it on my desk in front of me. But you can play, let's say you use that Gyutaro, sideline a character, play Enmu next, you can draw a card. If you use the flying blood sickles, then play Enmu, you can draw a card. That's pretty much it. Otherwise, you're not really using that effect. The only caveat to that is off of a color trigger. I love to use Enmu to play Enmu off of a color trigger, because a lot of times in a turn, if your opponent probably has used some specials, has used some removal, you've lost some characters, they hit your life, you hit a color trigger, the purple color trigger, which is the Gyutaro 4-cost, you play that Enmu, you draw a card for free, because that still applies. It's their turn, but it doesn't say you can't draw a card during their turn, so it still counts. So you can draw a card from this effect. All around, really solid character, but beyond all of those reasons to have this Enmu in your deck, he serves as a fantastic raid target for the 4-cost Enmu, who is one of your stronger cards, and we will talk about Enmu when we get to him. But for now, let's move on to a very important card for this deck, which is Gyutaro. 3-cost, 2 energy generating Gyutaro, who also has the active trigger. So there's nothing wrong with having more active triggers. It's always great. But this Gyutaro's real selling point is his when played effect that, again, lets you draw a card. As long as you have a Daki on the field, and chances are good you're going to have a Daki on the field. By the way, keep your 0-cost Daki on the back line, unless if you're looking for some early game rush of opportunities. If you don't need to rush, keep that 0-cost Daki on the back line, 1-cost Daki on the front line. That'll ensure you have Dakis in play to use some of these powerful effects. So, Gyutaro gets to draw a card. If you have a Daki on the field, you draw one, sideline one. You see more cards. That's super important in TCGs in general. It's not, in some ways, it's not as important in Union Arena because you're so limited per turn to what you can do. However, it's still great. Seeing more cards will still help you do better. And it's one of the strongest, if you haven't picked up on it, it's one of the strongest benefits of this particular build, is just how good this draw engine is. So you have 4 of these 3-cost Gyutaros. This Gyutaro, you are not going to want to use as a raid target if you don't have to, but it's totally fine to do if you have to. It's definitely preferable over playing Gyutaro 4-cost Gyutaro unrated. The reason why I say don't use them as a raid target if you don't have to is because you do want to have a solid energy line later in the game, just in case you have to play Akaza to close things up. So Akaza is a 6-cost character, which requires a pretty hefty energy line to get that off. The way I build this deck, I'm not really looking to use the Akaza every game, and I don't tend to need the Akaza every game, but it is still good to keep that in mind. Obviously, your 0-cost Gyutaro is the preferred raid target, but you can use a 3-cost if you need to. Moving on, the other 3-cost character, and I do run 4 of these, is the Rui. So actually, I've had someone point out to me on my Twitter feed that it's very hard to get Rui's effect with when played. So he says 3-cost, 2 energy gen, just like Gyutaro. Only has 2,500 BP, so he's a little weaker as an attacker, but you don't really want to use him as an attacker. And he does have that active trigger, so it's a solid card all around. He does have a when played that if you sideline this turn, you can lower someone's BP, opposing character's BP, by 1,500. That's pretty insane. In decks that use a lot of sidelining your own card effects, this is actually a really strong character. In this deck, again, you're not probably going to use that when played all that often. And he's more here because you need 2 energy and because he's got the active trigger. But there are some occasions where you might play a special and then combo that special with a Rui to get some incremental removal against smaller characters. It's not impossible. It can happen. It just probably won't happen all the time. But again, he's here largely to have this just added energy gen with a trigger. So that's great. Moving on. We are going to talk next about the card that is really the core card to this deck strategy, and that is the 4-cost Gyutaro raid. This character is crazy strong. He has a built-in draw engine. As long as, again, you have Daki on the field, look to keep that 0-cost Daki on your energy line. You can raid this Gyutaro. You can pull him off of that when sideline from your 1-cost Daki, get Gyutaro in your hand, and then you can raid him onto any of your Gyutaros in the field, and you are going to be able to draw a card when attacking. That's super helpful, and it keeps the flow of cards to your hand. I think the other effect is really strong. It's a once per turn. When this character attacks and wins a battle, switch it to active. Keep in mind it's only once per turn. I think that's easy to forget. So if he somehow switches again, I don't know why that would happen, but if he switches again to active, you can't do that again. But it's super effective. This sort of acts as a baby double attack / baby impact. The reason why it's a baby double attack is that double attack is kind of stronger in a way because it forces your opponent. It's not dependent on winning the battle, but it's also kind of like impact because your opponent basically doesn't want to block and lose, right? They don't want to block. I mean, he's at 4,000 BP, he's getting through most blockers. They don't want to sacrifice the blocker because he's going to restand, so they basically just let this guy through. So it's sort of a guaranteed hit on the life. I think the only other occasion where he's super effective is that late game as a closer, because late game all of a sudden they can't let him through, right? Maybe they have 1 or 2 life left and you have 1 or 2 Gyutaros in the field. They can't afford to let him through. So now all of a sudden they have to block, and you have 2 of these on the field. You're getting through 4 characters in a turn. That's insane. And it's not like it's whenever he attacks. It's not like like most there's not a lot of ramifications or stipulations around this. Like, for example, a C2 that has double attack, it's really hard to get that double attack to work. Or like a Tengen, it's only the turn he's played. This doesn't have any of that. He keeps this effect turn after turn after turn, which makes him super scary. The other character Gyutaro, the final Gyutaro in this deck, is also quite strong, and that is the 4-cost Gyutaro 2 action. I will say this card, in some ways, at first can seem a little underwhelming. I had trouble with him. At first, I didn't run the full 4 copies because I was like, well, 2 action is quite a lot to pay for just sidelining a 3,000 character. And I also really am not a huge fan of his when sideline in this deck because I'm not really looking to pull Daki out of this deck. So I'm not using that 3-cost raid Daki. So, but he actually ends up being really strong. And he has the purple color trigger, which is super strong. It's my second favorite color trigger. And honestly, it's pretty close to my favorite. It's a really strong color. It's a really strong trigger. So the color trigger alone really makes it worthwhile adding 4 of these to your deck. And he's better in this deck than the other color trigger available in Demon Slayer. So you definitely want to include 4. And that sidelining 3,000 or less, I would not overlook that. In this kind of a deck, this deck doesn't play fully aggro, but it does have a very aggressive play to it. You have to really, you're just kind of pummeling your opponent with all these powerful characters. So softening up that field can do a lot, especially with your Gyutaro. If you think about it, you get rid of their smaller defenders, and they are forced to defend with Gyutaro, and he can just get through them and get removal. He can take 2 in a turn. So Gyutaro, 2-action Gyutaro is not a laughing matter. He's a strong card. I think if he could remove 4,000 BPR characters, he'd be insane. But I think for what he is, he's quite strong. And you can actually use him as a raid target. Don't forget that. You don't want to do it a lot because he's got a 4,000 BP, which makes him a solid attacker. But there are occasions when you just really need to get that aggressive play out and raid into your 4-cost Gyutaro. We also have Enmu. So I highlighted this earlier that we were going to have the 4-cost Enmu. This Enmu is so strong. I really like Enmu. When you play him, you get to draw 2 cards and then place 1 from your hand into your sideline. That in itself is just really a powerful effect whenever it shows up on any card. And then if you have 15 or more cards in your sideline, Enmu gains 500 BP. That's awesome. So later in the game, Enmu, when you have those 15 cards in sideline, that can happen quicker against some decks, slower against others. You're going to be able to basically block opposing 4K attackers and still have Enmu the next turn to attack with. So that can really put a damper on your opponent's plans later in the game. On the character side, last but not least, we have Akaza. So Akaza is a really strong character, but you're not going to use him every battle because he has a lot of prerequisites to playing him, basically. He's 2 action points to play, which is a lot. However, he does come in active. So that is huge. So when you play him, he does come in active. And then when he's played, you just discard 2 cards from your hand and he gains Snipe and Impact. So he's granting you a life. Kind of like, this is a lot like Kurapika, if anyone's played Kurapika. A similar kind of selling point there. You're going to take a life, you're going to remove any character you want as long as they don't have more than 4,000 BP, and that can win you the game. He's a powerful closer. I think the only reason why I don't play him into him harder is that this deck plays pretty aggressively, so you're not going to always have 6 energy on the energy line. You will often, though, have the cards in your hand. This deck draws a lot of cards, so it's not usually an issue to discard 2 to play Akaza. So that is not a problem. It's more just having the energy on the energy line to make playing him worthwhile. But that's why there are only 2. I think if you wanted to play harder in that, you probably want to rebuild your deck a little bit to have a more robust energy line. But with what we currently have, you can justify playing 2 of these characters, and he's a powerful, powerful closer. The special is the final thing. Obviously, you run 4 Muzan's Blood, which is the final trigger. And then the Flying Blood Sickles is a pretty standard special trigger card. It removes 3,000 BP characters when you play it, or 5,000 if you have Gyutaro on the field. So that's a very strong card, and I actually like it better. I was testing a deck or playing a deck for a little while that I did quite well with that played Lower Your Heads, and I think that special is good and can also surprise your opponent because it only costs 3 energy, but I do, for this build right now, prefer the Flying Bloodsickle card. Okay, so we have gone over every single card now in the Demon Slayer Gyutaro Purple deck. Let's talk about some of the matchups. So I'm just going to go off the top of my head, what the matchups that I've faced are and how they fare. Let's start with the one I just tested right now in front of myself here, which is the Code Geass Purple matchup. This matchup has not really proven to be a terribly difficult one for me. I've beaten it multiple times in tournaments. I think the key thing here is the key advantage you have is you are just I say this all the time, so if you've listened to me a lot, you're probably tired of hearing this, but Geass Purple really does fantastically if it establishes the energy line, and it flops if it doesn't establish the energy line, and you are way less dependent on a higher energy line. This deck operates the entire time really effectively on a 4-cost energy line, which is a lot easier to establish than maintaining a 5-cost energy line, which is what Code Geass Purple needs to do. So that might sound kind of mystical, but what that really means is that you can play more aggressively without the liability. So you can get away with more early game than typically Code Geass can get away with. So that's going to be your main advantage. If you get to the point where you're just removing, you're trading removals, Code Geass Purple does have better removal than you. But you do have plenty of that. You have a more aggressive play style, and you also it doesn't hurt you terribly to get removed because you have a lot of cards that benefit you from getting removed from the game. So you can like take a force block with Gurren onto your Daki 1 cost and then search for that Gyutaro. So you have a lot of plays against Code Geass Purple. I'm not gonna say that like it's a massive advantage. That's your only advantage is that you can just play more aggressively. So it's going to depend on just a lot of variables, how well you do, but it's definitely not a bad matchup. It's relatively even with perhaps a slight edge in your favor. Let's talk about another really common one you're going to face is Blue JJK. I have won against Blue JJK with this deck, but I wouldn't say it's a favorable matchup. I would say probably odds are in Blue JJK's favor. That deck is just so strong. I think the only real nice thing about facing down a Blue JJK deck is you don't have to worry about any 5k attackers or defenders. That's the real problem this deck has is when it's trying to attack against 5k characters because you don't have anything in this particular build to boost. You can use your Rui to lower that BP stat a little bit to make it more manageable, but you don't have anything else to boost or lower, so you can really get stalled if you're trying to swing through a 5000 BP defender like a Lancelot or something like that. It can really slow you down, and then your Gyutaro isn't restanding, so it really nullifies your raid Gyutaro, which is your strongest card. So the real thing, what I do against that is I don't really worry about that too much, and I just go super aggro, and then I use Akaza late game to close things out against just if my opponent fields any smaller characters, which they typically do, almost always do. You can just use Akaza to close the game out and not have to worry about swinging through those 5000 BP attackers. There are other options if you wanted to change your build a little bit. You could also go with the demon powers. I've tried that out, and when it works, it works. That's great. But the problem I've had is it's just I rarely have the demon powers when I need them against the 5000 BP deck, so I just haven't. I've cut them for this particular build. So that's it. I think also I went way off topic there because I was talking about Blue JJK. that is how you deal with 5000 BP decks. So that's like mostly your Lancelot or your Kurapika are the two that come to mind the most. Pay attention to that. Against Blue JJK, I think another interesting thing is the Gyutaro, I think actually does I think it does get through the Nanami. So, for example, if you attack and they defend with Nanami and then they rest your Gyutaro, I believe your Gyutaro should then restand. So that's kind of nice. It doesn't stop your Gyutaro. If you have 2 Gyutaro on the field though, they can obviously stop your other Gyutaro, but it won't stop the Gyutaro that gets restood. So that's a nice thing to keep in mind. This deck, you don't really care too much about your cards in your sideline, so the fact that Blue JJK doesn't send a lot to the sideline is not an issue like it is against Purple Bleach. So that's sort of my thoughts around the Blue JJK matchup. I've definitely won some and lost some against that matchup, but I think Blue JJK is just a strong deck in general. So the fact that you can beat it is still a pretty good incentive for playing an off meta deck like Gyutaro. I think the other ones. Let's think if there's any. I think let's move on to the specifically Demon Slayer, your rare battle format, right? So these are the decks you're going to run into in rare battle. I think you're really going to do well if you use Gyutaro in the rare battle format, because there's just not. I think the only deck that has more removal than you is going to be Yellow Tanjiro. So Yellow Tanjiro has a little more removal, but it's not a lot. And it is dependent on a lot of comboing. So I think I think that's going to be your main difficulty is Tanjiro. It can also be pretty aggressive if they're doing that Nezuko play. You're going to definitely want to try to out aggro that deck, because it can get really dicey if you let them get through your defenses and pull off a bunch of attacks in a turn with that swapping out shtick that deck does. But it's not a huge threat. And I wouldn't put that Yellow Tanjiro as a huge threat to this deck. I think also if you get to the point where you have that 15 cards in the sideline, you are going to be able to fare pretty well, because you can block like the impact attacks from Tanjiro with your Enmu, so that's really helpful. And then also, I think your Gyutaro can be really helpful in that matchup, because that deck loves to rush a lot of like switch in some weaker attackers and rush you, and then you can play your 4-cost 2-action Gyutaro and just sideline those weaker characters. So not a huge threat there, but that is going to be the strongest deck you're going to face down in that format. I think Muzan has not been an issue for this deck. This deck is just so much faster than Muzan. You're just going to do so much damage before they can really do anything back to you. So I wouldn't worry about a Muzan build in the rare battle format. I think Red Zenitsu, that Red Demon Slayer deck, there are some fun, tricky things that deck can do. But overall, this deck is more reliable. This deck also has that higher end removal with Akaza. So you have a bit more going for you on the removal side than Red Demon Slayer. And they rely a lot on getting the cards they need to be able to deal with you. So that should not be a huge issue. So in the Demon Slayer format, really you're just worrying mostly about Tanjiro. And as long as you're playing this deck right, it should fare pretty well against the other decks that you're likely to face. So, with that being said, I love this deck. You probably can tell from the way I talk about it. I've put a ton of time into getting this deck to work, and this current build is my favorite version of the deck. So I hope you enjoy, and make sure to subscribe. Check out my website for more info if you aren't a fan already. Leave a review. I would love that. We have a couple of good reviews for this podcast already, so if you like it, please leave a review and help other people know that this is worth listening to. And with that, until next time.